Thank you very much for your kind welcome and for the introduction. It's a little odd, I can't see anyone, and that's never quite as nice as actually seeing your faces. And that also means that I really want to start by giving a huge apology for not actually being in the room with you. I wish I was. It's been a long time since I've been in Porto, and it would have been my first in-person conference in a very long time. And I was going to come until very recently, but I have an underlying health condition, which means that I was quite worried about the spreading variant, and I may be overdoing things, but I'm very grateful to the organizers for letting me appear at the very last minute electronically or digitally. So with that, as we are speaking in the midst of one crisis, I want to talk to you about another. And it is quite a journey I want to take you on. It's probably a little methodologically hazardous in a way, because partly in the context of your conference, it isn't a strictly speaking literary account that I'm going to offer you. Rather, I kind of want to trace, or perhaps in a sort of Benjaminian fashion, to try to uncover some of the conceptual and narrative constructions that have shaped Brexit, and with it also a very peculiar understanding of Brexit Britain today. And core to that project is, as you can see, the concept of crisis. Now, from the UK's exit from the EU, of course, has often been referred to as Britain's greatest crisis since the end of the Second World War. And from inside and outside, certainly the country is really caught in a process of instability, of change, of transformation that leaves virtually no sector or business or even government untouched. But crisis is, of course, not just an objective process. It's also about subjective and interpretive control. The concept of crisis allows us to really describe a situation that is still in flux, to capture the nature of a new era, and also to predict, or at least talk about, its possible future, that is, to impose a certain kind of interpretation. So in my talk today, I'm mainly interested in that latter part. I'm not here to take you through the political steps of the crisis. We'd probably be in for days on end if I did that. But rather I want to look at the way we talk about crisis and the way that we, political leaders and observers alike, have rhetorically framed crisis. By going back to a sort of conceptually historical attention to the term itself, I want to look at how that might allow us to understand the nature of the predicament more clearly, but also understand how we narrate it, how we represent it, and therefore also how we have shaped events. But I want to start by looking at a few examples, and if there's any problem with the PowerPoint, then please shout. You probably have to shout, otherwise I won't hear you, but do shout. Okay, starting well. There we go. So this is The Guardian's Michael White, revealing really a spectacular foresight only 3 days after the referendum. Brexit crisis indeed didn't end for years. Then only 3 days later, our American friends concurred, even if they might have been confusing Brexit and the referendum in those very early, also innocent days. Then 2 years later, Brexit is already diagnosed as causing an ever greater, really transformative crisis of British politics and British society. And then another 2 years later, what we have, of course, is the first Panorama programme dedicated to the Brexit crisis. Just before the deal was signed last year, the Irish Times gave us an ever so encouraging and obviously rather correct reading of what was likely to take place during 2020, and even once we left entirely, at the end of the transition period in December 2020, as things were not really looking any better. The question is, what precisely do we refer to when we speak about critical situations, about crisis? Two hypotheses to get us started. The first is we think of crisis above all as really drawn out periods of very unsettling instability and uncertainty. We may see crises, for example, as a chain of events that lead up to a very perilous, dangerous situation where things may change significantly, but we don't yet quite know in what way. Or we may experience it as historically unique, of course, as a sort of a special event never previously occurred, but that might yet, in some respects, be recurring in the future. That's protracted, that's persistent, that just won't go away, it may segue into another new crisis after. We've really become used to crisis as a sort of imminent, a sort of enduring and perhaps even defining criterion or condition of our present lives, a sort of new normal. And that's also in the words of the German conceptual historian Reinhard Koselleck, who I'll be referring to quite a bit today, and whose probably justly famous 45-page entry to his own dictionary on political and social language has become impossible to evade when we want to talk about crisis. So in his words, crisis has become now, today, a structural signature of modernity. Hypothesis number 2 is that crisis talk matters. Our semantic repertoire, our narrative constructions, they do give meaning to events. They also shape beliefs and they shape our understanding and expectations surrounding those events. At the same time, though, the term crisis has lost its analytical rigor. Not least since the 18th century, we've seen a huge proliferation of the term. It's been used in political vocabularies, obviously referring to external and military questions. It's found its place in economic theories. It's become an absolutely central theme in the German philosophies of history, so prevalent in the 19th century Enlightenment period. It finds its place, obviously, also in medical psychology and in social and cultural theories of modernity. And that sort of abundant and really increasing use of the term has arguably turned the concept into something of a sort of rhetorical staple, if you like, whose analytical value, if anything, sort of tends towards zero. The French linguist Antoine Meillet called such a process of degradation of a word semantic bleaching, a sort of whitening, a sort of wearing out of the word itself. Others more positively have described it as a semantic redistribution. So when new meanings of a word arise over time through processes of metaphor, of metonymy, of transfer. And as Koselleck has put it himself, there's been an absolutely enormous quantitative expansion in the variety of meanings attached to the concept of crisis, but few corresponding gains in either clarity or precision. So if it's too indiscriminately used, the term really obscures as much as it sheds light on the dynamics in play. But arguably, the usefulness has not run its course quite yet. And in fact, I think, and that's part of the core of my argument, is that if we look and read both with and against and beyond Koselleck into the history of the term itself, we can maybe come to a much more nuanced understanding of what the Brexit narratives were about, the nature of the dilemma and its rhetorical drivers. So let's start perhaps at the beginning, which is with a look in the dictionary. I quite like doing that. The etymology and the conceptual history of the term, for me, is one of the most instructive starting points. This is the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, of course, and it reveals 2 surviving definitions. So the pathological one, the point in the progress of a disease when an important development or change takes place, which is decisive of recovery or death, a sort of turning point. And then, obviously, in a figurative way, a vitally important or decisive stage in the progress of pretty much anything. A state of affairs, certainly, in which change for better or worse is imminent. So crisis, in other words, has actually originally, very, very little to do with uncertainty and instability per se. It's rather been having a lot to do with certainty, with being decisive, or more accurately, perhaps it marks that sort of point, the exact point at which uncertainty tips over into certainty. It marks, in other words, a decision. So let's unpack this a little further. As Koselleck also outlined in his conceptual history of the term, krisis has its roots in the Greek verb krino, to separate, to choose, to judge, to decide, but also to quarrel or to fight. Originally then, crisis had sort of three overarching meanings that can be distilled in most of subsequent crisis talks throughout the century, and that is at the heart of Koselleck's project. But let's look at those three overarching categories first. So first, legally, it described, as we said, a decision, both in terms of a decisive turning point, an observable moment of change, and also at the same time in terms of the subjective activity of judging and in the activity of taking a decision. And those two distinct domains, the subjective and the objective, were sort of merged in the development of the term over the years. And very soon, krisis actually came to refer to quite legal instances of judgment, of trial, of court decisions, and also from there to state decisions and even electoral decisions. So krisis, in that context, I'm quoting Koselleck, gained a high constitutional status through which the individual citizen and the community were bound together. The second theory, as you can see here, originates in the corpus Hippocraticum, so Hippocrates, the ancient Greek medic. And it's the medical theory of crisis. And it too refers to the observable objective condition in illness and the judgment about its progress, identifying then sort of that tipping point towards either recovery or death. And centuries of linguistic translations later, of course, that also then begins to mean the sort of time span that leads up to a final decision. So it doesn't just think of the turning point, but the sort of way that takes us there. Third, then, through the translation of the Old and New Testaments in particular, a semantic shift takes place. With Christianity, the first, the sort of legal meaning, as you recall it, is theologized. Crisis begins to mean judgment before God. And then obviously enter stage right, apocalyptic expectations, right? The notion of the last judgment that really comes in the guise of a trial and enacts the end of history. And as I will try to tease out in the following half hour or so, is that these original three connotations do help us clarify, interestingly, centuries down the road, the nature of the Brexit crisis and its rhetorical framing. So etymologically, the concept of crisis, as I've just outlined it, is one that forced choices between absolute opposites, right? Between life and death, between right or wrong, between salvation or damnation. And even where it indicates a transition towards a new state, the heart of crisis is really the notion of a decision, a judgment, a choice, an action. As Koselleck puts it somewhere, it once had the power to pose unavoidable, harsh, and non-negotiable alternatives. So consequently, my first and perhaps most important contention today is that we best understand the crisis that Brexit has wrought upon Britain in these past few years, not by looking to that sort of imminent, transitional, recurring sense of uncertainty that we associate with our modern condition. Rather, Brexit can be understood best as a crisis of the original concept of crisis, as a failure of choice, a failure of judgment, a failure of decision-making. Not now in the normative terms. It's not that the wrong decision was taken. I'm not talking about this right now. It's the fact that what characterized Brexit's real crisis was an incapacity to decide. A crisis as indecisiveness then, as a seemingly interminable failure, well, certainly for many years, to reach a verdict. And that's really structured Britain's European politics throughout the period 2016 to 2020. Let me talk you through some examples. The first is that the UK government, for a very long time, did not know what it wanted. There is abundant evidence, really, and because this is a literary rather than a political conference, I'm going to spare you the details, but there's abundant evidence that the UK really didn't know for several years what exactly it wanted. It wanted out, that much was clear, but how that out looked like was not. The cabinet, which Theresa May appointed, was evenly split between what were called Remainers and Leavers, right? And therefore, neither of the two sides could really agree on the course to take, and that's really what the EU thought too. The EU held the pen for the talks really for the biggest part of time, another good evidence of the failure on the part of the UK to have made any clear decision. So the government found it difficult. The public, interestingly, didn't really know what it wanted either. So historically, as you know, public opinion on EU membership has always been divided, and here's quite a nice sort of case that takes you from March 2012 to September 2020. Just a month before the referendum, and less than a month after it, it was entirely evenly split, as you can see here. So there was those who were thinking that leaving was a mistake. They have since historically been in the majority, mostly consistently, but effectively the population continues to be split practically down the middle. But the general election, you say, yes, the 80-seat majority that Boris Johnson won, and yet the split remains. The vote share of pro-leave, so his Conservative voters, was 45.6%. The pro-referendum or Remain parties came in at a total of 50.3%. So again, a reconfirmation of the divisions, despite obviously what was effectively a landslide victory for the Conservatives. So in other words, there's been a continued reference to the idea of the will of the people. This will wasn't really unitary, and it wasn't really homogeneous. Instead, it really continues to be very, very split. Most importantly, of course, Parliament didn't know what it wanted either. And that's perhaps the most important thing. The people's representatives in Parliament couldn't reach a decision. And I want to pick out a few examples here. So the no deal votes, this is what the slide is up. Theresa May negotiated a withdrawal agreement, which she put to Parliament and which failed spectacularly several times. So what it did then, given that it couldn't get it through, the government brought forward a motion of leaving without a deal. And there was an amendment tabled by an MP called Caroline Spellman, and that ruled out no deal, right? So it made no deal not an option. So withdrawal agreement, no, the no deal out. And that passed just by the narrowest of margins, you can see here, 312 in favour, 308 against. So withdrawal agreement wasn't in, no deal wasn't in, so Parliament tried to find a new way forward. And it was called something like indicative votes. The indicative votes 8 propositions of what could be taken forward, and all of them failed to gather the necessary majority. A second round of indicative votes also brought none that commanded a majority. So on the 3rd of April 2019, in another vote, the House sought to schedule a third round of indicative votes, and that too failed in the very first tied vote since 1993. So I'm saying this not to draw you too much into the political details here, but it's really to show the extent of indecisiveness here. Begin to see that Brexit really was, between 2016 and 2019, a crisis of, in today's understanding, of crisis in its original understanding. That sort of crisis as indecisiveness, and the inability to decide has really structured the negotiations and the political debate in Britain for many years. And it's also paved the way, as we shall see, for a new kind of politics to emerge. But before we come to that, I want to investigate that sort of indecisiveness a little further. So if the above holds true, the UK's Brexit crisis was by not so characterised by a decisive will of the people, but a great sense of uncertainty and indecision. But what was the nature of that? So arguably, I think we can make out a dual criterion. First, it was the incapacity to decide between two stark alternatives in favour and opposing Brexit. Of course, there were quite a number of positions in between, from no deal to very soft Brexit to a second referendum, but the battle lines were really drawn between two camps. And these camps or factions were roughly of the same size and matching in strength in numbers. They were thus held, sort of for all intents and purposes, in equilibrium, right? Neither could gain the upper hand. The country was locked in an internal conflict that seemed irresolvable for 3 years. And to shed light on those sort of ramifications, I want to turn to another ancient Greek concept, that of stasis. Now, you'll be familiar with the term primarily through the contemporary usage of it, of the adjective static mainly, right, which is characterized by stability or equilibrium, by stable and constant, even by something like objects that are not physically moving. So obviously, stasis seems to be the entire opposite of crisis. There is no transformation, there is no change, there's no movement at all. But it will be relevant, bear with me. Because, as you can see here, in the second connotation, the OED also notes, stasis also means civil strife, civil discord and conflict. That may surprise you, but bear with me, it is precisely that sort of etymology which sheds light on the nature and rhetorical framing of the Brexit crisis. So I'll talk you through that a little bit more in detail. Etymologically, the original meaning of stasis was that of a position, and of course then a standpoint, right? And that evolved to designate a group of people sharing the same standpoint, a faction, effectively. And from there, and in its plural form, it came to denote groups were holding opposing standpoints, opposing views. And from there, stasis shifts to denote the conflict between those groups. Thus, we arrive at civil discord. And most famously, perhaps, it was the Greek historian Thucydides who used stasis to describe a state of internal conflict of civil war in which the opposing forces were very equal in strength, and neither was able to dominate over the other. Now, Thucydides' classic account is of the civil war between the factions of the democratic and the oligarchic factions in Corcyra in 427 BC. And it's an account that's really one of a widespread slaughter and societal breakdown, abuse of law, and a collapse really of any political order. I do not want to suggest that we're there with Brexit or that we're ever getting there, that's not my point. But stasis holds a really important explanatory force still for our context. And that flows from the fact that stasis in its original form conveys a form of arrest, of stagnation and stoppage, a stoppage of the circulation of any fluids of the body, as you can see here. Picture these sort of ancient Greek city-states shuddering to a halt, the early democratic body politic arrested, stopping in its normal operations. And that's because Aristotle had identified political friendship, so the idea of common well-being, of shared norms and agreements about civic life as the governing principles of the polis, the idea of a kind of public common life. And stasis entirely undermined that principle. Under stasis, citizens crystallize into opposing factions, and consequently they also turn against the common institutions and the common overarching political life, because they believe that this no longer represents their interests. So loyalty is transferred from groups within the polis as from the polis to individual groups within it. So the question is how that sort of concept allows us to understand, to frame, to narrate the question of Brexit. And there's various aspects to this. The first is that it highlights the polarization and the paralysis that I've already tried to hint at earlier. The myth of the will of the people has been, of course, a political linchpin of the entire Brexit saga. But as we've seen, electorates split down the middle. In 5.5 years since the referendum, and this really counts still today, this rift has not dissipated. On the contrary, Brexit identities today really mean more to us than party political affiliation. And this is from political scientists Sarah Howald and colleagues, say that these Brexit identities generate affective polarization as intense as our partisanship, so as intensely held as previously political party affiliation, in terms of the way we see others, in the terms of prejudice that we hold, in the terms of how we think about others and politics itself. And that's reflected in a stand-up in Parliament. This is Ken Clarke, a Conservative MP, but kind of historically well known to be very pro-European. And he says this in one of the speeches in Parliament in September 2019, where he pinpoints the paralysis, the paralyzed confusion, says it entirely reflects the division of the public, where there's no clear majority for anything. Everything except the opposition to no deal has been blocked, either on the one hand by hardline right-wing people who do not want any deal with foreigners, and on the other hand, he says, people's vote, people who will not vote for anything that involves leaving the EU because they want another referendum. Right? So rather than saying Parliament was disrespectful of the will of the people, he quite correctly identified that there's the polarization of society that was absolutely reflected there. The second notion that Stasis helps us to think about is that of a sick, of a diseased body politic. Stasis in this political context had a very, very clear correlation with medical explanations of disease. Solon, in ancient Greece, called it a spreading ulcer in the Athenian polis, an advanced illness of the political organism. A deep wound, as the Greek historian Nico Laurent has written recently quite wonderfully, a deep wound in the body of the city. So its meaning was that of a body politic afflicted by an illness, with all the sort of circulation, all movement stopped. And as we recall, of course, Crisis 2 had that sort of medical horizon of meaning, right? There's Hippocrates, and later Galen, using it to identify both an observable turning point in a disease and also to judge the progress of the same. And metaphorically expanded, this sort of medical notion really became quite prevalent, even in sort of early modern Europe, then descriptions of the state as an organism, as a body politic. And we're aware of that. Think of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, but I've brought you up another kind of description, which I find even more powerful still. And Hobbes, among many others, then use also metaphors of political disease or infirmities, as he calls it, which trouble the health of the Commonwealth and which need management, which need treatment even. Yeah? The French philosopher Diderot, in the context of the French Revolution, says something a little similar. He calls the crisis caused by the French Revolution as an effect of an illness like that which precedes the crisis of a sickness. A secret fermentation begins in the state. Terror makes real what was feared. On a very different political scale, and several years later, so essentially later, the Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz's well-known pronunciations about the war compares revolutions with paroxysms, with convulsions. And I always have in mind that sort of the depictions of the early sort of hysterical, the medical descriptions of the feminine body in hysterics in the early sort of medical theory. And And Koselleck, in fact, himself, although we can't really go into it too much today, by retelling his entire history of crisis, links it with critique to relate what he calls the pathogenesis of modern society. So the development of the disease that afflicts us today, and it's one that's called in constant critique and transformation. So both stasis and crisis have this kind of medical connotation, but stasis has no positive, no therapeutic components. Crisis does gesture towards the possibility of recovery, and in their interplay, they do let us think about the dynamics of politics at a moment of really deep-seated change or upheaval. Portraying paralysis as a sort of affliction that diseases the revolutionary change heralded by the Brexit vote to begin with has offered political leaders certainly the opportunity to shape beliefs and shape expectations in what the future might hold and what is necessary to save the nation's well-being. So polarization paralysis, a sick body politic, and thirdly, another thing that Stasis lets us think about is the idea of judging time. So crisis, as we've seen, connotes a change, a transition from old to new, a threshold crossing movement, if you like. By way of crisis, therefore, we also diagnose time and sort of offer a prognosis, a likely future of development in the events at hand. Stasis, of course, is entirely opposed to any movement. It's both duration and equilibrium, and it is, in its conflictual political variant, entirely negatively, a complete dysfunction. There's no redeeming function to it. In ancient Greece, it was understood as a wasting away of the justice of the city. To identify the crisis of Brexit as one of sort of static indecisiveness, of paralysis, then offered some political leaders also rhetorical opportunity. And that is, of course, considering that we are there to, political leaders seek to secure power, to maintain power, they need to shape belief in the future, what is possible in the future as an overcoming of the difficult present. And in this case, then, it became one that was targeted specifically at the unlocking of conflict, of the undoing of stasis, and I will come back to that. Now, two considerations flow from the above that are relevant in our context. First, there's a relative, so rhetorical framing of crisis on part of some political factions, and certainly the media, in a way that directly or indirectly delegitimized deliberation, contestation, or even judicial review. You may remember this. Parliament and judges who were actually fulfilling or even reclaiming their constitutional roles were increasingly portrayed as bringing democracy into disrepute, rather than as the cornerstones of that democracy to begin with. Examples are the cases that were brought to the UK Supreme Court, the Miller case that argued for the role of Parliament in triggering Article 15, the Cherry Miller case later on, which fought the prorogation of Parliament shortly after Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. And I'm sorry if I'm sort of presuming some of the knowledge here. These are really examples that we can go into later. What I want to particularly focus on is that sort of rhetorical framing, that representation of what was going on. Because, as we recall, narrative framing matters. It gives meaning to political events. And I'm quoting a political theorist here, Naomi Claire Lazar, said it provides a range of more or less sophisticated techniques to help legitimize or delegitimize political innovations. So, taking recourse to terminologies of treason, of treacherousness, of betrayal, which were unchallenged and at times even supported by government ministers, these sort of terminologies sought to kind of construct in the minds of the electorate the notion that the constitutional function of Parliament, that is to scrutinize, to debate, to talk, to discuss, and the constitutional function of the courts, in this case to review the lawfulness of a decision or an action that was made by a public body were illegitimate. So perhaps we can sum up the attitude as follows. Parliaments busy themselves with talk and normative debate. And what is really required is decisive action in the moment of crisis. The Liberal, faced with Christ or Barabbas, convenes a committee and a discussion. It cannot be left to a committee to manage existential matters. So as you can see, this is not Boris Johnson. It's from an article by Nomi Falazar on decisions and decisionism. More to the point, she is paraphrasing the work, Political Theology, of the really controversial political and legal scholar Carl Schmitt, very closely related to the support of Nazism in the early 20th century, and who's shaped the idea of the decision and the importance of the decision in politics. Without going too much into detail here, Schmitt argues that with political modernity, the decision is really properly recognized as the moment where you can put an end to chaos and to conflict. And clearly the Liberal Democratic Parliament is decidedly not where Schmitt sees that sort of decision emanating from. Now, I don't want to suggest that the current UK government is seeking or let alone representing a sort of sovereignty as proposed by Schmitt, which is really, in its original account, fundamentally incompatible with a parliamentary democracy, by virtue of the sovereign here having, in his view, unlimited authority, absolute discretion about the way the law operates. Obviously, in our liberal democracies, there are times, critical moments where it might be important for us, for a political leader to act decisively, without that meaning that we're descending into authoritarianism. However, the rhetorical framing of Brexit's deliberation as paralyzes us, as the cause rather than the symptom of the crisis, had really significant correlations, ramifications, because they correlated with a shift in public opinion. And do note, I'm careful here, I'm not saying it was the cause, but it was certainly correlating. And that really was quite prevalent, obvious, in an audit carried out by the Hansard Society of Independent Research, a body into parliamentary affairs. In April 2019, 72% of British voters stated that the system of government needed reform, significant improvement. 42% thought politics could be improved if government didn't need to rely quite so much on votes in parliament, and a quite staggering 54% said they wanted a strong leader willing to break the rules. So this obviously made calls for decisiveness for the decision electorally really salient. And in July 2019, as we know, Boris Johnson was promptly elected on the key promise to deliver Brexit, or as they put it very, very successfully, to get Brexit done. So on becoming Prime Minister on the 20th of July, he said, the British people have had enough of waiting. The time has come to act, to take decisions, to give strong leadership, and to change this country for the better. Excuse me. And then in his first speech to Parliament, just a day later, he goes on similarly. He says, we must take some immediate steps. And the first is to restore trust in our democracy. And that the entire government is committed to leaving whatever the circumstances. To do otherwise would cause a catastrophic loss of confidence in our political system. Now, Parliament did manoeuvre in the end not to leave on the 31st of October, but what is important, I think, is the understanding that a commitment has to be done whether or not Parliament thinks it's the right way to go. Rhetorically then, crisis, critique, deliberation, scrutiny were portrayed as weakness, as a pathogenesis of the Brexit situation. On the contrary, the decision, decisiveness as a capacity, as a criterion, was elevated. Right? While a sort of liberal politics of compromise, of negotiations, were rhetorically linked not to the exercise of politics as we understand it, but rather as an evasion of politics itself. So, last bit. So far, I've described the whole entire Brexit saga through two early etymological components of the concept of crisis, decision and disease. And obviously the way that these have been politically and rhetorically framed. What I have deliberately left out so far is the third component, which you may recall, which is the theological. And for those of you who do read Schmidt, this obviously segues quite nicely from his discussion of decisionism, which took place in a piece of work called Political Theology. Now, in his conceptual history of crisis, Koselleck describes a decisive shift in the semantics of the term between that sort of Hippocratic medical theory and Christian exegesis. With reference to the New Testament, crisis was paired with judicium, with judgment, to signify judgment before God. And it became to sort of imply a prognosis of time, a prognosis of absolute change, even a prognosis of the end of history. Now, that sort of theological component has been secularized over the centuries. We're not really talking about last judgment in clearly Christian terms these days. But that sort of apocalyptic, eschatological element that does remain forceful, quite forceful and familiar, I think, to all of us who follow the sort of pronunciations of political utopianism, wherever it might emerge from. And Carl Schmitt is, of course, one of its most infamous proponents. But the interesting thing for us, I think, is that such a conception of crisis that it postulates, of course, a rupture with the past, but it is purely future-oriented. It thinks about the future. Our crisis now, that sort of framing seems to suggest, is just an anticipation of a final desired outcome, a political future, which looks entirely different. In the Brexit context, we can see this taken up very frequently, from the very early days of the Leave campaign to the pronouncement of the Prime Minister ultimately charged with delivering it. Some of that framing is more, shall we say, traditional in its iconography. Take that first step, the same speech that I got up here now on the 25th, where he said, "Our mission is to deliver Brexit for the purpose of reuniting and re-energizing our great United Kingdom and making this country the greatest place on earth." And in his announcement on Brexit Day itself, on the 31st of January last year, he said, "This is the moment when the dawn breaks and the curtain goes up on a new act in our great national drama." Other framings were perhaps slightly less traditional. See, Boris Johnson being Boris Johnson, he talks about the UK as ready to take off his Clark Kent spectacles and leap into the phone book booth and emerge with its cloak flowing as the supercharged champion of the right of populations of the earth to buy and sell freely among each other. With a bit of a wink then, I would put to you that it's this latter framing too that is not unlike some of Carl Schmitt's work. The sovereign decision of the constituent power, after all, as Schmitt puts it, is like a miracle. Because, and that's Schmitt's words, the power of real life breaks through the crust of a mechanism that has become torpid by repetition. So, to sum up very briefly, I wanted to show today is how crisis is really mobilized in narrative constructions, both to mark out a moment of truth, to define and impose a particular reading on a critical situation, and to diagnose not just the present, but really project that present into the future. The particular sort of political utopianism that we've seen espoused in later stages of Brexit posits that sort of possibility of breaking with the past, creating a productive crisis by overturning stasis, if you like, and positing that one can indeed act on history. And with that, I think I'm done. Thank you very much.
Well, while you organize your thoughts, I may perhaps start with a question myself. And since I'm here, I'll take a minute to elaborate a little bit on that. Uta, thank you very much for your lecture. And I've had the opportunity of reading some of your articles as well. That was thinking, you mentioned that taking decisions, the process of decision making, we tend to think about it as a very rational process, but you mentioned that emotions are very much present and that they function like intensifiers for the whole process. So as you were speaking today, I was thinking about that, and I was also thinking about the pandemic situation, and if you feel that it changed in any way the way that British people see Brexit. Do they feel better because they have left, or a connection with Europe would make things better? I don't know, how do you see things, how people talk about that, if they talk about that at all?
Thank you. I would say that the extraordinary fact is that we read every development, every crisis through, I suppose, our pre-existing positions. Certainly with regard to Brexit, we have seen that there has been no significant change in the positions of people. I think what has changed over time is that I think there's a majority of those who think Brexit doesn't, the kind of Brexit we've had does not deliver the sort of outcome that people wanted on either side, but it doesn't change the fundamental assumptions of them. And it just reinforces each side's understanding of the position of where the fault lies with the other side. It is an interesting question that the pandemic came in practically the day that we left. And I recall our institute organized a bit of a Brexit party on the 31st of January. And a month later, we were in lockdown. So there is a sense of extraordinary coinciding that has made it very hard to disentangle the effects of one and the other. That's been helpful, I think, for the government in that, you know, the general confusion and change of circumstance cannot be tied to a single cause. I don't think it's changed the narrative very much. And so far, it hasn't touched Brexit sort of champions too much. The current government is still quite well entrenched, despite fervent opposition, of course.
Thank you. Other questions and comments?
I think I would have a question. I'm not sure whether Uta can hear me if I'm using the microphone from the room. Does
a little
that
bit.
work?
If not, then if you shout.
All right. Okay. Well. Thanks, Uta, for that. That was fascinating. I was wondering, with regard to this expectation that elected representatives will not suffer from indecision, and in that sense will not be critical, but rather, active rather than contemplative. Would you read into the whole Brexit and post-Brexit situation also a crisis residing in a mistrust of representative democracy? Because it's something that people often discuss when you start resorting to referenda as the way out of difficult circumstances that supposedly cannot be sorted by a parliamentary democracy, then you are faced with a different sort of crisis, all the more surprising, I suppose, in a constitutional setup that was traditionally hailed as the very cradle of representative democracy.
Thank you. I caught some of that, but I'm afraid I didn't catch all of it. Am I right in thinking that you're asking about the impact on parliamentary democracy versus the direct democracy as represented by referendums, and how the constitutional settlement has been affected by that sort of shift? Do I interpret that correctly?
That's it.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Sorry, this is hard to piece together. Well, interestingly, there is a shift. The audit that I mentioned earlier does show that people, the electorate certainly seems to think that direct democracy via referendum can be used effectively to address difficulties of state. So there's a certain shift to that, but I think it does really come as part of that continued rhetoric of where true political legitimacy actually resides. The idea that there's a certain purity of purpose from a unified will of the people that could be translated directly into legislation. And it's a difficult proposition, of course, because it does diminish the idea that Parliament, as our elected representatives who do a lot of the thinking and arguing and scrutiny on our behalf, have an interfering rather than a facilitatory role. So the constitutional settlement, if you like, is in question. The government has also announced it wants to review judicial review. So it wants to limit possibly the role of the courts to review legislation passed by Parliament, and to think about the relationship of the courts to politics. However, it is unclear at the moment to what extent that proceeds or will proceed. We do, I think, see a range of developments that are worrying, but I do also want to take the sort of warning of some of my laws colleagues into account, who say we want to understand these developments as a sort of waxing and waning of rule of law issues, a waxing and waning of certain populist streaks which come and go. So I'm not suggesting here that the future of the UK is now radically changed, but what it is very clear is that there's a certain change in understanding of who we are, which is in some respects why I chose this word for your conference today, of who we are, how we narrate of who we are, and how well we respond to certain kinds of depictions of who we are. And clearly here, the government has been able to frame its own narratives more successfully at a moment of decisive political upheaval than Parliament has.
Now we have another question. Would you like to use the microphone?
Okay.
We'll try.
Yes. I would like to ask you if young adults, the newest generation, the ones that can vote, but probably they didn't vote, are they engaged in this new government's narrative still, despite the lockdowns and the confinement, the pandemic? Thank you.
Okay. Were you able to understand? Asking about the younger generations, and are they part of this narrative,
Yeah.
general narrative, especially after lockdown and everything?
Interestingly, I think throughout the opinion polls, if you stratify them by age and education, the younger people get, and the better educated they get, the less they get drawn into that sort of narrative. The more naturally pro-European they tend to be, more naturally concerned about certain developments they tend to be. I don't have any figures at hand, but the last time I looked at them, that's certainly been the case. So it's not necessarily the majority. So again, I think we need to understand the population as being very differentiated in different groups and also split in different camps. And I think the younger generation would see this in slightly different ways, which of course is a significant issue, but at the moment, because obviously we are in electoral democracy, has not really managed to make a difference at the polls. So the decisions, even though they're made for future generations, are harder for the future generations to change at present.
Okay, Mark has a question too.
Thank you. I would like to ask about your views in respect of the instrument of using referenda to determine how you frame an issue of debate, in this case, Brexit. You mentioned framing the rhetorical question, if you like. Would you say that it is in terms of a referendum, is it a sophisticated tool or is it a blunt instrument? And I ask from the perspective of being Irish, and we have used referenda very successfully in Ireland for many years, and it's obligatory under Irish law. And this very issue of EU participation, we have used it very well. Even when we rejected the Treaty of Nice in 2002, it actually instigated a debate, a deepening debate in Ireland about the EU, and it was very healthy. And it led then to some changes which created the Treaty of Lisbon. So I would like to hear your views on that, please. Thank you.
So the use of the referendum as a very sophisticated or not so sophisticated tool to making decisions.
Yes, I think you mentioned the Irish case. Is that right? Yes. Okay. Obviously, that's a point of a lot of controversy and discussion in the political science literature. Everybody has their own point of view. I may be particularly skeptical about this, but I know that obviously the referendums are being employed in Ireland. They're employed in Switzerland quite regularly, where we're, specifically where constitutional issues are concerned. I have a personal tie to Catalonia, where the referendum question has also been very much part of the discussions. I find it a blunt instrument for two reasons. That's my personal view here, rather than an academic view, because I'm not a political scientist by training. I find them a blunt instrument because they tend to pose an either-or choice, a black and white yes or no choice, whereas very often the devil is in the detail. And as we've seen with the Brexit referendum, we had a mandate, whether we liked it or not, for EU exit, but it was entirely unclear how that exit should be managed. So we had a mandate, but then we had, as I said, 3.5, 4 years of complete indecisiveness as to how that mandate should be translated. And that I find has then, if anything, exacerbated the divisions in the electorate. So that's one reason. The other reason is also that usually, certainly in the UK, one parliament can't bind future parliaments. It's part of the conception of parliamentary sovereignty as well, the idea that parliament can continue to re-legislate. So how does the referendum constitutionally fit into that if it sort of ties the future's hands, if you like, in such a significant way? There are ways, obviously, around some of those problems. One has been, for instance, used significantly in Quebec, where you had a threshold, effectively, both in terms of electoral participation and then in the outcome of the referendum result, both of which needed to hit a minimum threshold in order to be binding. And as we know in the Quebec case, neither of those, when it comes to independence, has happened. So I personally find it a difficult instrument. It doesn't mean that it cannot serve its purposes, and if it's long enshrined in the constitutional tradition, as it is, for instance, in Switzerland, and I gather in Ireland, then it can help. I think it's more difficult is if it's not usually part of a constitutional tradition, such as in the UK, and it's then used for one-off massive decisions without arguably this proper scrutiny that you would expect from even a normal general election in the UK gets the questions, the campaigns are scrutinized by the Electoral Commission in such a fine-grained, detailed way. The campaigns of the referendum were not in any way similarly discussed. So I do find the referendum a blunt instrument, but I'm not denying that it can have its uses.
Any further questions, comments? And I see something else regarding this. This is just not a problem that is exclusive when we think about Britain, but we think about Europe in general, and we have a lot of angry citizens, a lot of angry voters that do take advantage of these moments to say something about something without thinking about the consequences afterwards. I don't know if you agree with this or not, but it does pose a bigger problem sometimes, I think.
I think it's partly the way, that's why the whole concept around crisis I find so interesting. It's how how do we narratively mobilize discontent in order to provoke change? Where does that sit, and how easy is it to manipulate discontent for political ends that weren't actually the cause of that discontent to begin with? So I suppose the current dilemma that we're facing is probably a transformation of our politics, which we had quite naturally as humans presumed to be eternal, but which just turned out to be a post-war long drawn-out experiment, and they're seeing obviously changes and challenges on all fronts. And we will have to find how we're using and shaping those dynamics. I think there is a reason why people are discontent with the way they feel they have or do not have an input in the way decisions are being made at all levels. But the difficulty remains between that goes back to, well, Plato at the very least, to how much informed do you need to be to take decisions on behalf of others? And where are you able to abstract from your own interest and able to canvas and encompass in your decision-making the concerns and interests of others, or the collective is abstracted from the individual standpoint? And that is where, again, referendums tend to be quite blunt. There's a whole interesting sort of sub-narrative around the fact that usually the referendum, every vote counts. In the UK political system, usually you have constituencies, and it's a first past the post system, which effectively means that, you know, the person who gains 50% plus one vote takes the constituencies, and the rest of those votes aren't represented in Parliament. So in areas where you had traditionally a very clear majority for one party, those who weren't agreeing with that practically didn't have to show up to vote. Very difficult to overturn those really entrenched constituencies. In a referendum, however, every single vote counted. And that's an interesting sort of dynamic, and many people later did say that they voted for reasons not necessarily linked to the European Union membership.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Can you please help me thanking Uta again for a wonderful lecture?
Thank you. And I'm very sorry I can't be with you right now. And go to lunch and continue conversation for that. So I wish you a wonderful conference, and I hope I'll be able to come some other time.